Tonight on Nation to Nation, anti-Indigenous racism in the federal public service. How deep does it go, and what'll it take to fix it?
Western ways have removed emotion from their lives. That's why it's striking us down with 1,000 cuts. They can't feel it because they don't see it.
A Dene filmmaker uses TikTok to make Canadians aware of the toxic legacy of the giant mine in Yellowknife. She says it helped balloon a House of Commons petition from a few hundred to over 32,000 signatures.
I believe that it definitely played a role in snowballing the message to more people.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Systemic racism has been under a microscope lately. Discrimination by police and healthcare officials have sparked inquiries, protests, and calls for reform. And now 2 federal Indigenous departments are under fire, with Indigenous staff speaking out about the toxic culture in those offices. Letitia Wells is a former Government of Canada employee. She says the worst racism she faced was in the civil service, calling the atmosphere poisoned. Wells spoke out earlier this week in an APTN National news story, and she joins me now to elaborate. Ms. Wells, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
So just how widespread would you say this problem is?
Well, based on the reaction that I have received since the story aired on Monday is unbelievable. It's always scary to step forward in something like this, especially when there's health issues with your mentality regarding suicidal thoughts. Nobody wants to step out of that boundary because of the fear of what Western society will deem you as. And in my experience, people are stepping out across Canada to reach out to me and thank me for stepping out because, as the elder said, they're killing our spirits. The only thing they haven't done is physically kill us yet.
Now, you mentioned your personal experience. Can you share with the audience just a little bit of what happened to you?
Without getting into too much detail, absolutely, I'll stick to the facts here. And in my time, what happened to me was I believe I was the target of racism. I was bullied, I was assaulted, and I was physically assaulted. I had several meetings and several processes with several administrative law policies that led me into a circus of further trauma. Because when you're an Indigenous woman, and you have a background like mine, which is deep-rooted sexual, emotional, physical, and psychological trauma as a result from the aggressive assimilations of colonialism. And these cycles of violence are evolving naturally. And even though I didn't go to residential school, I suffered all of the effects that come with it. So I fled a domestic violent relationship quite a while ago. I entered university to try to rebuild my life again with my children. And I entered again the civil service. I've been a government employee of local, provincial, and federal. So I'm not specifying this to one area. I want it covered in all departments of government because the atmosphere is the same in that treatment. So I walked away and they inspired me to go back and begin research on this, on systemic racism, on the institutions, and on the lawless governance that they've established under laws of discretion. I wanted to know, how did they get away with it? And this is where I've come to now. I'm here. I've built a research. I don't want to get too much into my research because I don't want to give it away. So we'll leave it there. I hope that covers what you're looking for.
Well, it certainly does. And from what you've just told me, it sounds like it'll require substantial reform. So how are we going to reach that reform, and what should the changes look like? Well,
from an Indigenous woman's perspective, this is I'm a person who was born and raised in the Canadian Constitution, hence Indian Act. So the whole thing is racist. The whole thing has institutional racism built right within it. And the system hasn't been able to protect me since I was young. It doesn't start here, it starts way back. And so I think the violence that's targeted towards Indigenous people is so normalized that people such as the federal government cannot see the targeted attacks, and they don't see it as targeted attacks. They don't see it as.
Ms. Wells, so what can you do, though? I mean, is the departments, do we have to fire all the public servants, or what do we need to do?
I'm getting to that point because they can't see it. They need to admit that it's there. The first thing is the denial of racism. The second thing is they measure themselves against these alleged racism calls. Because I came out and I said, you're practicing systemic racism here. I'm not here to slam anybody. Let's work through this together and find reconciliation where we can fix the problem here. The third thing is laws. Laws are silencing people, and the reform needs to look like you need to allow authentic Indians to step in and take over. You need to step down. All reconciliation departments across Canada are led by non-Native people or pretend Indians or somebody who has the education in international Indigenous studies to carry that role, but nobody has the related trauma to help the Indigenous people that are screaming for safety because they're being dismissed by these laws. So you need to admit your racism. You need to admit that you're measuring yourself on racism here and you're failing at it because you don't understand what you're doing. You need to bring authentic Indigenous people in to lead that department. Senator Murray Sinclair has been screaming this. Canada needs to reckon with racism now. They need to understand what reconciliation looks like in government policy, in employees, in administration, and in those who govern Indigenous peoples.
Ms. Wells, how would you respond to the doubters, those who say this is just a few bad apples, one or two bad managers, but the problem isn't systemic?
I would respond to that's been in history. That's what Canada teaches their members, is to disregard us. They teach them the systemic racism, so we will be dismissed when somebody steps out to speak of this harm that's happening to us. That's what I mean about the violence is so normalized towards especially Indigenous women that they can't even tell that it's harmful to us. They think we're being crybabies, we're being troublemakers, we're crying about something we should be over. Like, get over it now. We know what you've been through. Let's move on. But the healing needs to begin in between what Canada has done to our women to today before we can move on. The women ourselves, we need to reconcile with the internal beings of who we are. And the people who say that this is not real have not lived the violence and the suffering that we have for over 400 years now. We're still battling it today.
Well, Ms. Wells, I want to thank you for speaking to me and giving me some of your insight, and I'm sure you will keep battling till things get better. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, APTN National News reporter Brett Forrester will detail what else he uncovered in his dive into the work culture of Indigenous affairs. Welcome back. As we just heard before the break, racism is widespread in the public service. Earlier this week, APTN News reporter Brett Forrester published the results of a deep dive into racism within Crown Indigenous relations and within Indigenous services. Employees described to him a culture of casual racism, toxic bullying, and widespread fear of reprisals. He joins me now to talk about the story and what's next. Brett, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Todd.
Now, why are public servants speaking up right now?
Well, it's in the news. We've seen a reckoning with racism in many different public institutions, police, hospitals, but it's also been making its way into the federal public service. And, these departments are quite old, and the Liberals, to their credit, make no bones about needing to reform the colonial structure and the kind of paternalist ideologies that are often residual within those bureaucracies. So for a lot of these individual staff, it's been decades and now 5-6 years under the Liberals of seeing great promises and lofty ideals, but not seeing these things delivered. Now the deputy ministers, the top bureaucrats, might dispute that there hasn't been any progress made, but the people that I talk to are out there in the trenches, and they point to the numbers. They say there's been low uptake to opt-in legislation that allows First Nations to roll back certain elements of the Indian Act. They say there's no real concerted plan to devolve services to First Nations when the stated goal of Indigenous services is to put itself out of business. They see this and they hear this, but then they're not necessarily seeing the results. And so the sentiment that I'm hearing is that enough is enough. It's time to make good on these promises.
So we're talking about things like, let's say it's Bill C-92, where Indigenous services is supposed to get out of the child welfare business. That's an example you're talking about. That's
an example, but there's also some of the different opt-in legislations, the First Nations Land Management Act, First Nations Custom Election Code Act, those types of things. The people who are out here administering these legislations or trying to get people to opt into these programs are saying they just haven't seen a lot of uptake in terms of the percentage of First Nations that want to seek government recognition. Now, C-92 is a little bit different. It's a bit newer. There's a bit of a different approach that the government is pointing to as a way to move forward, but we've also heard even today there's still some question marks about how this is going to be funded. There are groups who have said that they want to opt in, but how the process of what that looks like is still really yet to be determined.
What did you hear from the employees who you spoke to?
I heard several anecdotes that ranged from stories of covert racism, what's been described to me as polite racism, to stories of outright physical bullying. I had a woman who explained that her manager told her to leave her Indian status at the door when she was entering the department because when she was in the bureaucracy, she was no longer, quote, an Indian. And the more people I spoke to, the more I realized that this was a pattern. I would describe the investigation almost like a snowball, and as it gathered speed, more people began coming forward, often independent of one another. In other words, employees who didn't know each other, didn't work in the same building, in fact, might have occupied positions at different branches across the country, were telling me the same story. And what it begins with is that a young, perhaps idealistic First Nations person coming from their community has lofty ideas of making change and changing things from the inside and making things better that way. But these are people that are often most likely to find themselves marginalized within the department because they're willing to go against the grain. They're willing to challenge some of the residual assimilationist or paternalistic ideologies or policies that persist within the federal bureaucracy, and they suffer reprisals for it. And these reprisals have been described to me as insidious. They're quiet. There's never a witness. They're impossible to prove. And now these individuals become afraid. They're afraid to speak out. They don't trust the accountability mechanisms. They don't trust the whistleblower protection laws. So they weigh it in their mind, and they decided to come forward to the media because they felt that was the only way to get the attention they feel this issue deserves.
Based on these conversations and what you've just told me, what do they feel needs to change?
It's an interesting question. And based on conversations with public servants, you realize that politicians kind of occupy a nebulous space in their imagination. Really, the people who hold the power are the deputy ministers, as well as what are known as the central agencies of the federal government, the Privy Council Office, the Treasury Board, Finance, and Justice Department. These are the central bodies that are essentially responsible for running the government. They decide what's acceptable as legislation. They set the budget. They determine what's legal. They are the HR manager for the government. And they run, or they help run, I should say, all the federal departments. And so what I've heard from employees is that there needs to be some changes within the central agencies in terms of how they approach Indigenous issues and Indigenous affairs, because those two departments are not like other departments. They're not your run-of-the-mill line departments. They have very old colonial histories. They have responsibilities that are provincial and municipal in nature. So you're not regulating banks. You're not regulating fisheries or oceans. People's lives are in your hands, and there is still what people or what employees feel like are those colonial elements of the past that have yet to be reckoned with or have yet to be totally expunged.
Let's hope some change does come out of all this publicity. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Todd.
After the break, a Dene filmmaker is using social media to put pressure on the feds to clean up a toxic mess in Yellowknife. Welcome back. The giant mine in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories was abandoned in 2005. What was also abandoned was nearly 250,000 tons of arsenic dust and other contaminants. A teaspoonful of this dust is enough to kill a person. Authorities have been slow to clean up this mess, and people in southern Canada are often unaware of this toxic legacy. Dene filmmaker Morgan Seta wanted to do something about this to raise awareness and turned to TikTok. Here's a sample.
So my last Contamination Nation video made it on the wrong side of TikTok. Am I surprised that it didn't happen sooner? Not really. Am I okay with the racist trolls? Definitely not. The comment section of my last video is honestly getting a little bit too comfortable calling my people Indians and perpetuating racial stereotypes, and for the first time I'm literally too scared and too worn down to even look at my notifications. If you're Indigenous, if you're an ally, if you believe in land back, or if you're just generally not a racist person, could you please interact with this video in any way possible so I can make it back to the right side of TikTok? Anyways, thank you so much. Messy Joe.
To talk about her TikTok campaign, I'm now joined by Morgan Seta. Welcome to Nation, Ms. Seta.
Happy to be here.
Why are you using TikTok to educate people about the giant mine and its toxic legacy?
I already had a rather small or moderate following on TikTok throughout quarantine. I joined like quite a few other people did, but I felt sort of a call to action with the YKDFN petition that there was only the minimum 500 signatures that was needed to send the petition to the House of Commons. And if I could just get a couple of signatures through my moderate following on TikTok, which I knew through analytics, a good amount of my followers were Canadian, they would be able to sign the petition, and hopefully we can get that sent to the House of Commons.
Now, you started your videos as part of being in COVID lockdown and quarantine, as you said, and they were about your cat, your wardrobe, and your work as a filmmaker. But something changed back in December with a video about the murder of Brianna Manacho. What was it about that which changed how you began using TikTok?
I was watching a lot of the news roll out through case updates, through the witnesses, the murderer himself. I was really gripped by the fact that it happened in Yellowknife, in my home community, and that missing and murdered Indigenous women are happening all across Canada, even in these small remote communities. I felt I needed to add my voice, specifically being a local community member. I wanted to just shed a light on what people might not be hearing about further south.
You soon followed that up about Giant Mine. I think it may have been the next day or your next video. Mm-hmm. And lately your videos have been almost exclusively about that. Again, why is that?
A lot of my followers that I have gained throughout the Giant Mine campaign are very interested in updating and knowing about anything that is currently going on throughout the petition and through the Yellowknives NA campaign. And I felt like I needed to continue the conversation, that we still needed to talk about the Giant Mine petition and the Yellowknives NA campaigning the federal government for an apology and compensation. We still needed to talk about that even though the petition was over. And it was very almost, it was overwhelming to see the response, but to navigate through it and to find a platform to spread that awareness was very empowering, especially getting some of the recognition and appreciation from the band members and even some of the chief and council. It was really amazing.
Now, we've talked about this, you've mentioned it, this petition a couple of times now, and Northwest Territories MP Michael McLeod introduced it in the House of Commons last month. And do you think your TikTok campaign helped it get over, you said 500 signatures, but it got over 32,000 signatures?
Yeah. I do believe that my TikToks had some part of a role in spreading awareness, if not directly, then indirectly. Perhaps someone may have heard about the Giant Mine from one of my videos. They talked about it to their friends looked into it more. They might not have known that it was specifically from one of my videos, but I believe that it definitely played a role in snowballing the message to more people.
You also credited your campaign with getting a meeting with Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it's honestly, I believe that without the quantity of awareness or just signatures in general, I believe that it might have been swept under the rug. It might not have been immediately addressed specifically by the minister's office.
And again, we've been talking about this petition, but what exactly is it that the petition wants the federal government to do?
The YKDFN petition is calling for the federal government to apologize for their role in Giant Mine's toxic legacy, for compensation, for oversight in the remediation project that is currently underway.
And that remediation project is supposed to get underway next year. How confident are you at this point that will truly happen?
I am skeptical. I'm skeptical at what will come out of it, specifically with just a lot of the bureaucratic roadblocks, and I'm just skeptical.
Well, I hope you keep up the good work, and until something does happen and there is some remediation, you keep making your videos. And I want to thank you for speaking to me now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Messy Show.
That's our show for this week. I want to thank all our guests for coming on it. And I want to thank you for watching. I'm Todd Lamoran. Stay safe and stay healthy.